At $19, this wired PS4 controller is the cheapest one on Amazon. I'm going to quickly review it by examining the buttons, testing it out in some games, and taking a brief look inside it. I bought it with my own money. This is not part of an endorsement deal or anything like that. The controller does not have a brand name, it's just called PS4 Controller Wired. It's sold by Mayfan. Now for some direct comparisons to the DualShock 4. It is 40% lighter, which is very noticeable as soon as you get it out of the box. Wired controllers are normally lighter because they don't have a battery. The casing feels a little thin, like if I squeezed it really hard, it might flatten. I doubt that would actually happen though. The analog sticks are concave, the opposite of the DualShock 4. The edges are more rounded, and the sticks reach out of the controller about twice as far. When you do circles with them, the size of the circles are a little bit bigger than the DualShocks. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or not. Overall, they have less of a rubbery feel. Pressing downward on the sticks was easy and had a satisfying click to it. The home button between the sticks barely comes up out of the controller. The D-pad is also very shallow. When you're pressing it, it barely feels like it moves. This doesn't concern me that much, as the D-pad is not normally that important in modern games. The triangle, circle, square, and X buttons are flatter and not as glossy. They're a little bit more spaced out. The symbols on these buttons are a bit different than what typically appears on PlayStation controllers, probably to avoid copyright, but they are similar enough to not be confused about what you are pressing. The share and option buttons are very mushy and elongated. As a result, when you press on the ends of the button, only half the button goes down. This controller does not have a fully functional touchpad. It has this triangle button in the middle that replaces it. When you press it, it's the same as pressing down on the touchpad on the DualShock 4. You cannot do swipe functions that some games have, and some require. There is a smooth, glassy area that seems like it can perform swipe functions, but it does not. Do research to see if any games you intend to play require swiping before purchasing this controller. There is a light bar, but it is smaller. In a few minutes, I'm going to test it on a VR game that requires a light bar to be on. The R1 and R2 buttons feel a little bit loose, and the springs underneath them don't seem to be as strong. The R2 and L2 triggers are the most distinctive thing about this controller. It kind of looks like someone grew their fingernails for 3 years, then bent them and put them on the controller. They do fit the contours of my index fingers, but we'll see how they perform in the game. Other than their strange shape, they feel and function very similar to the DualShock 4. There is no headphone jack on this controller, which may be a deal breaker for some people. Buyer beware. Finally, I'll mention the cord. It is 6 feet long and a little on the thin side. It may not be long enough for some people who sit far away from their TVs, but there are USB extension cords that can be bought. To start using this controller, you have to plug it in, start the system using the power button on the console itself, then hold the home button on the controller for 3 seconds. The PS4 will then recognize it. You will never be able to turn on the system with this controller since it receives no power until the PS4 is already running. So let's test it out on some games. First up is Titanfall 2, my go-to first-person shooter. Within a few minutes, I came to the realization that the controller isn't that bad. I played 2 online matches and did pretty well as I do with the DualShock. I previously reviewed another cheap controller, and its analog sticks made me move around too fast. That didn't happen with this one. My direction and aim was a tiny bit off compared to the DualShock, but I think if I used this controller a lot over time, I would be able to aim just as well. Pressing down on the touchpad in this game shows the team's totals, something I do a lot. Since this controller reduces that large touchpad to a smaller button, I found myself pressing where the touchpad would normally be, hitting the share button on accident. So that was a little annoying. Even though I normally have the vibration turned off, I did turn it on with this test, and compared to the DualShock 4, I noticed it wasn't as pronounced a vibration, but it did function as expected. Overall, I found this controller to be surprisingly good for this game. Now for Killzone Shadowfall. The campaign mode uses the swipe function of the touchpad to command a drone that assists you. Since this controller does not have swipe functionality, I was not able to play the game. If you get this controller, research which games require that you swipe. Not many of them do. The online multiplayer for Killzone does not require swiping, and I was able to play it as normal. Next up is Geometry Wars. You pretty much just use the analog sticks. At this point, I did notice that the sharply rounded edges of these analog sticks made them a tad uncomfortable. If you take your thumb and press it on the corner where two walls meet, that's kinda how they feel sometimes. It's not painful, and I don't see it being too big of an issue. The last game I tested was a VR game, Astrobot. For this game, the camera needs to see the lights on your helmet and on the controller in order to work. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get it to recognize the light on the controller, so I wasn't able to play the game. It seems bright enough, I even turned off the lights in the room, but it still wouldn't detect it. The camera must know it's an unofficial light. I'm not sure if every VR game requires the light, but I think most of them do. In a minute, I'm going to take this controller apart, but here's my thoughts so far. For the games I was able to play, the controller wasn't that bad. It was definitely worth the money, and I'm probably going to keep it as a backup in case the DualShock's batteries fail on me one day. The analog sticks are a tad uncomfortable, and I accidentally hit the share button sometimes, but overall I did well in the games that were playable. I should mention I only used this controller for a week. There's obviously some quality issues that can happen if I use it in the long run. Some reviews on Amazon mention broken buttons or analog drift that starts to happen. I decided to get a little rough with it to try to wear it out. Doing this was tiring, so I wasn't able to simulate months of use, but I did go back and play Titanfall again and did not notice any issues. So let's take this thing apart and see what it has inside. They got a little overboard with the number of screws. There's 7 of them holding the casing together. It came apart very easily compared to the DualShock 4. Taking that thing apart is very tricky. I thought the inside would look a lot cheaper than this. It actually looks pretty well designed in my opinion, but I'm not an expert. I really want to get into the analog sticks, so I'm going to take out some more screws to get to them. They're very interesting looking, but I think the metal used will break down and bend over time. And here's what's underneath where the option and share button is at. As you can see, it's very soft, and it came right off. And you can also confirm by looking at this that there's no touchpad functionality other than pressing down. And that's all I have to say about this controller. Thanks for making it to the end of my video. May your games make you happy and smart. I'll see you next time.